I'm Karen Diller. I'm the library director of the Washington State University Vancouver Library in Vancouver, Washington. For over 10 years now, I've been really intensely interested in library design, particularly the design of the interior spaces and how that can help students really have better study spaces for themselves. When I assumed a leadership position on campus, this interest grew from really being focused on the library patrons and how they use our libraries, to also thinking about how the library design can help the institution itself reach its goals. Today, we want to have a conversation with you about how we approach the design to academic libraries, especially their interiors. So Sam Wallin is a librarian and project coordinator with Fort Vancouver Regional Libraries in Washington State, who has worked with architects and library staff on multiple building projects. Also with me, Sam has been researching the connections between place attachment and student preferences for study spaces. Brent Young brings over 2 decades of experience as both an architect and interior designer. He provides a measured approach to the projects, balancing concept-driven design with practical solutions. Brent has varied and far-reaching experience with projects on 5 continents, ranging from embassies, corporate headquarters, and university buildings to homes and adaptive reuse. He has taught architecture at Portland State University, Washington State University, and the University of Oregon. He is a principal at LSW Architects, who are located here in Vancouver, Washington, and their focus is on community-focused projects in the Pacific Northwest. This roundtable will be organized into 3 sections. First, each of us are going to talk for a short amount of time to set the stage for our conversation. We hope that you will find our ideas interesting and maybe even slightly provoking. Secondly, each of us will have a question for the other 2 panelists to respond to. And then finally, we will have a large amount of time at the end for an open discussion. A few other details. If you're on Twitter, the hashtag for this conference is RLUK22. And this session is being recorded and will be made available on YouTube and on FeedLoop in the next few days. You can also use chat to add comments or questions that come to mind as they come to your mind, and at the end, we will get to answering your questions. When planning a remodel or design of an academic library, librarians often concentrate on the transactional. Where will the service desk be placed? And on decreasing complexity for their patrons. How can we get someone quickly from the entrance to where they need to be? This concentration on the destination is understandable from a service model. However, it is the proposition of this panel that a strong focus on discrete service areas, replication of disciplinary silos, and a focus on the destination rather than on the academic journey may be hindering the library in its ability to impact student learning and to fully contribute to the mission of the institution. You may disagree. After some introductory remarks from each of us, we hope to have a useful and engaging conversation using concepts from designing a labyrinth. Beginning with my own remarks, I have organized them based on 3 roles. First, my role as member of campus leadership. Secondly, my role as just a citizen of the campus. And finally, my role as library director. First, as a member of the campus leadership, which is laser focused on enrollment, persistence, and retention, and a campus that is very dedicated to bringing equity to graduation and student success rates, and a campus that has a student body that's over 40% first-generation students and is rapidly expanding in its diversity. I am interested in how can the library building and programming assist in making transparent aspects of academia that are mysterious to students, especially first-generation students. How can we approach these students' journeys, not from a deficit thinking perspective? They have a deficit in what they know or what they should have known by now, but from the perspective that every member of the campus is on their own individual learning journey. How do we introduce the disciplines and types of knowledge they produce? And how does that translate to real life jobs? Can the building demonstrate a learning journey where the emphasis is on the journey with all of its twists and turns, making forward progress rather than on the destination or transaction where there is one right destination or a quickly completed transaction? Can the building and how one navigates it be used to introduce students to areas of study that they didn't even know exist, but may excite them? Encourage them to interact more with faculty, graduate students, or even local professionals in their areas of study? Can it show how knowledge creation and transfer really happens? What you see on the screen here is I have a slide on the left. You can see where destinations are pretty clear. The pathway is very clearly marked, but it's clearly just to transport you from where you are to some other place. Whereas the picture on the right, the pathway is in front of the woman that's sitting there reading. So the pathway, as you're walking through this pathway, you're seeing interesting little spaces to sit and maybe pull something off that shelf or look at a display that's on those shelves. So it's adding something to your journey. Finally, looking at a floor plan of a library that I think Brent is going to mention later in our presentation, this is very interesting. Notice what we're calling nodes, those areas of intersection and the areas that have displays or seating areas, or in this case, trees in some cases. They're places for interaction and they interrupt the paths. You need to walk around them, walk through them, pause, and perhaps spend some time in these new nodes in your journey. Secondly, as a member of an institution that has struggled, like most, in figuring out how to best support interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary work, when pretty much every aspect of the institution is designed around disciplinary silos, I am interested in how can the library be designed to support both solitary, disciplinary, and interdisciplinary research? How can we take the orderliness of the disciplines and shake them up, turn them inside out, show real life problems and how they are solved through building new knowledge through the intersections of disciplines working together? Create a winding path of disciplines with nodes of interactions and relationships that demonstrate these disciplines working together. As the heart of campus, can we assist our institutions by showing the way, by providing space for interaction? Again, you see the image on the left, which is, really traditional for libraries, right? You walk along this aisle and you see all these spines of books, pretty uninteresting, and they're orderly in our silos of subject areas, but completely uninteresting to look at. Whereas if you look at the display on the right, you see that this invites you to interact with the materials on those shelves, to see how they're relating to one another and what's inside them. It's like we're opening up the books. And finally, at the bottom, I think this is one of Brent's doodles on our way to this paper, where you see this silo of the discipline or the subject on the left. And what happens if we open that up and we make it a curve, and perhaps that curve seamlessly interacts with the next curve or the next subject? And how would that really make our library design different? Thirdly, as a library director whose research interest is in designing interiors that students find conducive to study, I am interested in creating interior spaces that are flexible and provide the greatest variety. Students tell us that they select spaces that speak to them, spaces in which they feel that they belong, spaces that are interesting. It has artwork, windows to green spaces, etc., but spaces that aren't too busy or too distracting. Sometimes they want high energy places, and at other times they want quiet, reflective spaces. Can we accomplish my dreams in my roles of 1 and 2 and still ensure spaces for study? And I just wanted to comment here that I heard the presentation from Lancaster University earlier today, and their statement on space that needs to be changing, needs to be active, engaging, and to co-curate materials within those spaces. I think you're going to see all of these themes throughout our presentation too. These are what brings me to consider other design metaphors for an academic library. Is it possible that a well-designed library based on the metaphor of a labyrinth can emphasize the learning journey, highlighting the inevitable twists and turns and the wonder and curiosity of what might be beyond the next corner, while de-emphasizing the frustrations, barriers, and dead ends of a maze? And you're going to hear more about labyrinths and mazes from Sam. Over to you, Sam.
All right. Thank you, Karen. So I want to quickly explore a few things. One is the student learning journey and how it changes over time. The next is mazes and labyrinths. And the third is IKEA. So less experienced students tend to look at learning as a transaction. They spend time and attention and get information in return. And their goal is to acquire the information that will help them get what they need, whether that's grades or a job or someone's approval. But usually around the time they find a topic that they are passionate about, they realize that learning is transformational and that who they are and what they bring to learning is important. And as they learn, they see themselves changing. And as they change, they see old information in new ways. It's a cycle that leads to transformation and the development of new knowledge. It's a process and not a transaction. And they're on a learning journey that is complex and takes time. And I think in library design, we tend to group users together based on their transactions. And then we design in a way that supports these different transactions. But when students come to the library to study, they're not coming to the library for a transaction. They're coming for an experience. They're looking for an environment that puts them in the mindset of study. And they're not just looking for information. They're looking for inspiration, community, a feeling that they're in a place where discovery is possible. And I think this is important too, that many people come to the library to study specifically to be around other people who are studying. That's all part of the environment for them. And so I think we need to think about the library as an action that people are taking and not a transaction. It's an experience. It's a dynamic environment that you surround yourself with and move through. Next slide. So now I want to talk about the difference from our perspective between a labyrinth and a maze. And I think this is important because both terms are really relevant for describing students on their learning journey. So a maze is a puzzle, and the goal is to solve it as quickly and as efficiently as possible with as few unfruitful choices as possible. Right, you start at point A and you want to get to point B and then you're done. Next slide. It makes me think of those experiments they used to do with rats and cheese, where they put the rat into the maze and the little X there in the center is where the cheese is at. And so over time, the rat learns how to get quickly and efficiently to the goal, and they leave the rest of the maze alone. I think there's a parallel here between our concept of the inexperienced student trying to complete the learning transaction as quickly and as efficiently as possible to get to that thing. Next slide. But a labyrinth is not a puzzle. A labyrinth is an elegant way to explore the entirety of a defined space. It's a single path that leads to a central point only after crossing every other part of the space. When you walk a labyrinth, you approach this point, you circle it, you retreat from it, you look at it from every angle, from different distances. There's lots of twists and turns, but there's no wrong turns. I think this is a nice parallel with how more experienced researchers approach a topic, where your increase in understanding and perspective is more important than the acquisition of any specific fact. I think, if we think about space, if you had a maze and a labyrinth covering the same space, it might be possible to solve the maze faster than the time it would take to walk the labyrinth, but you might waste a lot of time in the maze and end up taking longer than the time it takes to walk the labyrinth. And either way, in the maze, you would still only see a small amount of the area covered by the maze. So when I think about library design, I think libraries might be inclined in their design to try and simplify the maze for students. They see students in the maze, they want to make the maze easier, make it easier for them to complete transactions. But the experience of learning, studying, and discovery isn't necessarily something that benefits from simplification. It's a complex process, and it benefits from order and structure, but I think simplification just makes it less interesting. So if your library is maze-like, the goal should be to make it more like a labyrinth and not just simpler. And one more thing, when we think about the center of that labyrinth and how it compares maybe to a library space, I think each person entering the library has their own center that they're working toward. And so we might see the libraries having multiple centers or nodes around which many people are circling as they research. Next slide. All right, so if you've ever been to an Ikea, you might have seen a map like this or had the little brochure that you can get to help you navigate. But the Ikea is a store, department store that has three general areas. That first square, you'll see that's the showroom area. In the middle is a more traditional shopping area. And then the one on the right is the warehouse. Next slide. And in the warehouse, that's where, and in the traditional shopping area too, it's where people find all of the same thing, each in its specific area. It's where you find all of the stuff on the shelves. They're all stacked up. You basically have to have a code in your hand in order to find the thing that you're looking for, which probably sounds familiar from a library perspective, right? You got to get your subject heading correct. And so all these similar things are gathered together, and it's really just to make the transaction as efficient as possible. Next slide. But in the showroom, we're seeing all the different parts come together in a new configuration. It's a curated space that's been created by people at Ikea to try and bring all these different parts together to inspire people as they're walking through the showroom. So there might be 10 or 12 of these different rooms curated as you walk that path through the Ikea. So libraries, I think, tend to be more like the warehouse or the shopping area where we gather similar things together for easy transactions. But I think it's worth exploring how libraries might be more like the showroom. So instead of gathering traditional library services together, each in their own area, can we gather components of different service pieces into a variety of different nodes? And might these nodes help break down the silos by maybe exploring the overlap between disciplines rather than solidifying the discipline or reinforcing the silo? Next slide. And I just love this labyrinth. This is one of my favorites that I found so far. But you can see within it there is the idea of the nodes at the three parts of the triangle and the heart in the center, referring back to what Karen was saying about the library being the heart of campus. So this pathway is a little bit more chaotic than your traditional labyrinth, but it's still a labyrinth in that it is one path. And so might a pathway through the library kind of wind around these nodes and be an interesting way for first generation students or new students to discover and explore what's possible. And, as we think about what goes in these nodes, would students and faculty from these different disciplines be interested in participating in the development of these spaces and helping us curate these spaces? And could we create spaces that encourage to explore and interact and to participate in what's going on, to be a part of the community, and not just be there to complete a question or complete a transaction as quickly as possible? So now I'm going to turn it over to Brent, and I think we're going to switch over our presentation from one person to another. So that might take just a moment. Take a drink coffee.
All right. Is that working? Can you see it says design on the screen? So as the architect on the team, I'm thinking of the application of these ideas and how we can implement these concepts into space and architecture. And so what I'm going to bring out of this is not design solutions, but more about design departure points. So when we think about the components that we have at our use, the goals that we have are creating wonder and curiosity, having a designed experience that creates enjoyment. One parallel would be considering a children's library and how that's designed for experience more than anything. So also important is the clarity of organization, but also the expression of the content. What is it that's in all the books? What's in the materials? And then also we are considering expanding the reach of the library and the footprint. So the design tools that we have, the primary design elements that we've been considering are, one is the pathways. The second one has been talked about before is these nodes, which are the destinations in the library. And then there's the resource interface, which is the between the user and the information. So those are the three components that we wanted to talk about. So the first one being the pathways. So consider the various disciplines that are housed in a library. So for instance, there could be astronomy and art. So say the black is astronomy and the gray here is art. And so what happens when these are next to each other? It creates a juxtaposition. And this is something that we could take advantage of in our design of the space. How and where do we create paths that express the nature of these two disciplines? Can we harvest the potential inherent in the juxtaposition? We have the opportunity to design the relationships between the users and the information. So instead of maybe them just being side by side, there's an overlap. And what do you do with that overlap of information? It sets up a potential for cross-pollination or the expression of material. Also, the path that we plan, either taking people through various disciplines or two destinations within that discipline. A key aspect of this is focusing on the individual's movement through space. This is where the library becomes a verb instead of a noun. And so when you bring together multiple disciplines, what happens at the intersection of those disciplines? So finally, and there's so many iterations that you could consider when you're thinking about just the relationship of different disciplines, but this one represents one field, say it could be art or math, and then one completely enveloped in it could be considered poetry. And what would the combination of those two be? So the second tool that I mentioned are the nodes themselves. So these are the destinations, the events within the library that are curated. So this is a place where there's potential for expressing the ideas or the materials that are housed within the books and the media within the library. So this is a place that can be highly curated, and it's a place that can have a revolving display. So take, for instance, a library. This is a footprint of the library. This just happens to be the library at Washington State University where Karen works. So this is the floor plan of that library. So consider a node in that footprint of the library. So this is a place where it brings together information, and that information is expressed. And then this becomes a primary organizing element for the library. And everything else, the location of stacks and other components are designed around that node. And there can be multiple nodes. There's other things can be brought together, other ways of curating the information. And then again, configuring the rest of the library around that primary component. So the third piece of this is the resource interface. So the aspects that are in the library, the many layers of materials and information. So first layer being the physical resources themselves, so the books, and the stacks, and the media that's in the library is one layer of this concept. Another layer is the technology that can web it all together, weave it all together. There's on one hand book addresses, a way of wayfinding for locating materials, but there's also access to data, also audio-visual experiences, and even virtual reality. Another third layer, which we wanted to emphasize, was the people that are involved in the library, the human resources. So the librarian, and bringing the librarian to the forefront. So on one hand, curating the nodes, but also being a role player on the floor of the library, not just behind a desk, but out there on the floor interfacing with students. There's also, we have the notion of professors, teachers being involved in the library. So not just out in their departments, but actually having a footprint in the library. And then students themselves, students within the discipline and the community of learning that's being fostered in the library. So let's go back to the Ikea example. A common, familiar, something that we're all familiar with, but it brings to light some of the components that I just introduced. One is the pathways. So it takes advantage of these adjacencies. It creates overlap and exposure of the various things that they're trying to sell, and expression of various aspects of a home. So what they've done is they've created an identifiable route. And so this is where the experience becomes a verb and not a noun. You move through the space. And there are multiple zones: the lighting zone, the workplace zone, the living room zone. And it's not fully controlled, but it's a highly designed labyrinth for self-exploration. There are nodes where you're expected to stop and look, where the goods are shown in curated vignettes. There's various settings to reveal the options and ways of implementing the products. Also, resources. So the display, what's available. There's goods that you can pick up and interact with. And they bring various products to life by putting them into a setting. There's also the layering that I talked about, the layering of the goods that are on display, and the different ways to shop, browsing, looking things up in technology, catalogs, and then of course the people, the staff that are sprinkled throughout the space as resources, and even people that are in the space using the items become part of the display itself. So in the library, I'm going to shift gears and now talk about the library application itself. And what does this mean? What do these components mean when we start talking about designing a library? And so, talking about the pathways, we want to consider the adjacencies. We want to look into overlaps, exposure, and the expression of multiple disciplines together. And so the pathway can take us through these. So as I said before, this is the verb component of the library, where we are moving through an identifiable route. It's not just a traditional route. However, it can also be a route created by wayfinding, using color to define a route, a path, or using color to designate different zones. Also, clarity of destination can be a tool for us. The peaks and previews of where we want to go, just being able to see beyond where we are and understand a destination or a place that's pulling us to it, or even a color in the distance that's denoting something important beyond. The nodes themselves are important components of the library. So this is where the ideas are informed and information is curated. So it can be a physical destination. So as you see on the screen here, it's either a place of display, a place of gathering. It can be a well demarked place with signage, or it can be a place where people assemble to gather. These nodes can also be destinations as technological portals. So introducing technology into the library is another way of creating nodes where you access that technology. And then getting into the resource interface. So think of the ways curated display of information can be put out there in the library. How can excitement and curiosity be fostered in the information? So what can you put on shelves? How can you display the books? How can the media express itself? There's also the specific topics and examples of materials. So it can become thematic, and these can be rotating and revolving displays, and they can put the various disciplines together. This is where some of the blending of ideas can happen. And then the expertise. So the people forward notion of the library as labyrinth, the human involvement. So there's the expertise of the librarians, there's the professors, and we propose that they become integral in the expression of ideas in the library. There's also the learning community, the students that are at the library to learn, and even potentially students working in the library within their disciplines. There's also, of course, the books and other materials that are a representation of the wholes. So the books don't go away. They actually become the fabric of the building. They express the easy access to the materials, and technology becomes a tool to make it easier to find what you're looking for. So I'll finish here with an example. This is a project by Wallin Architecture. It was a design competition, and Karen showed this earlier in the presentation. The concept is based on the labyrinth. They're using the metaphor in a different way that we're using it. But because of the formal appearance of the labyrinth, it offers us some of the same attributes that we see of value in library design. So one is the path and the way that the labyrinthine layout can create this provocative pathway through the library that takes you to the various nodes, which can be curated as you move through the space and refreshed as the librarian wants to bring out and express different ideas in the library. So now I think we're going to shift gears and put questions out there on the floor. I'll stop sharing here, and we can have our faces on the screen. So if you don't mind, I think I'll start out with a question, and then I believe Karen and Sam also have questions to ask. But the one question that I think is interesting is our notion of having people be a part, one of the layers of this labyrinth, is that the librarian becomes more front stage. The librarian's role is to be out there on the floor interacting, also to be curating. So being involved in making new designs and engaging with the various disciplines and putting together the various displays, or at least directing that work. So my question that I'll pose is, how do you bring librarians along? It sounds like a lot more work that we're proposing, and what is it about this that would make the librarian want to move in this direction?
Yeah, so the thing that comes to mind for me is that part of this is centering the student and the student's experience, and that is certainly a part of most libraries' mission or their vision, right, is to be centering the student there. But there's also pieces of it that are about engaging with different disciplines or being a liaison, that kind of idea. And I think that we think about this as a space that facilitates the work that librarians are trying to do already, right? We're trying to give them a kind of significant, visible, like evidence of collaboration, I guess, is one way that we could look at it. And my background is in public libraries, but I can tell you that library staff love the chance to participate in designing a little bit of the space. They love making displays. They love working with partners, and they love that the collaboration that comes with that. And so I think speaking to that energy, that opportunity for partnership with other important people that they work with, around the campus, I think is a way to kind of approach this and get them really engaged and energized around that. What do you think, Karen?
Well, give me a second because I want to share my screen because it's interesting. My answer to this also connects with a question that we just received in chat. So let me just get to a slide that I want in our presentation. Just 1 second. Okay, Brent, I know you had it in here. I just skipped it somewhere.
While she's presenting, Carolyn, I see you've asked a question, so we'll get to that momentarily. Thank you. And Alice, I see another one that's just come in.
Okay, now bring it back to Zoom. I'm just going to put this up while I answer the question. Well, Sam, you mentioned a couple of things I think that's important to think about. One is bringing librarians and staff into the design process from the very beginning, I think is always helpful. So get them involved and also involve faculty and students from around campus. And then I do think that one of the payoffs for this type of approach is that it does help us have more reasons to connect with others outside the library, right? To curate those nodes. Maybe we get the anthropology club involved in curating the node that that is going to highlight anthropology, or we offer office hours for a faculty member in biology in the biology node. So I think it gives us even more reasons to make those contacts outside the library. So I think that could be a strength that would be of interest to staff. And then also I think we need to, and this is where I'm going to kind of segue into one of the questions that we got into chat, is that I think one of the things that we haven't fully realized yet is how technology can now be even more incorporated into our buildings to allow us to not have to worry so much about that organizational structure. We might be able to make connections using technology so that maybe the active part of the library is not ever going to display all the books, right? They will be located somewhere else in the building, but that we can easily connect students to what that is because we can browse the shelves now through technology. Let's see. Yeah, self-checkouts. You know, you don't have to go to a particular location. If you find something in the node that you want to check out, pull it off the shelf and check it out there. And so technology kind of frees us up on this. And the question in chat that I wanted to connect to during this part was a question about how do you curate and provide the nodes. And actually, I'm going to look at the exact question again.
Yeah,
but the current content in your library may be digital rather than print. How do you showcase that using wider library spaces? I think that's where this image that Brent showed really showcases that, is that you could have within these nodes, there could be technological displays that are displaying your digital content. And maybe you have, maybe that might be a great way to actually expand interest across the spectrum of your patrons, is that you have a large technology display that connects them to the digital resources. And maybe next to that, you have a shelf showing some old object, right? An actual physical object. So I think there are great ways in this plan to bring in and showcase your digital content that could be hidden right now, basically, go to our website, to get to the digital content.
I would just add to that about the virtual or digital content that having technology provides the ability to expand beyond the footprint of the library as well and into other departments. And if you can get campus-wide buy-in to this, then investments in technology and investments in technological display can really start to web this whole campus experience together for the library.
Yeah, one of our design charrettes that we did around this, one of the architects brought up the concept of augmented reality as another potential kind of layer where you could use technology to allow people to see layers of information, which could also be curated. And speaking to what Brent was saying there, these layers don't have to be limited to the library itself, that the augmented reality layer could help the library permeate your whole campus environment in an interesting way. So another question that I had, and it kind of getting back to the idea of metaphors and the use of metaphors for designing library spaces. The more traditional library metaphors are usually around what the library is, like the heart that Karen mentioned. I've seen like mountains of information, those kinds of metaphors. And this seems to be a little different in that it is a metaphor that is for an action or for movement or for an experience. And I was wondering if, Brent, you might say a little bit more about that. You talked about it in your part of the presentation, but I haven't also heard Karen's perspective on that from the library director position.
Well, I just think that, the way I think about it a little bit more is actually maybe not a metaphor, but more of as a guide, because it isn't so much about the physical manifestation of the idea, but more about the experience that we're trying to create. And so it's where the library today feels like a noun. The book, you think of the book stacks and you think about the place. And I think where we're leaning is more that the library is not a noun, it's a verb. And it's about moving through it. It's about the experience and the place that you're created and what you see along the way, and then the destinations within the library. And so when this is all curated, you start in a different place. You start thinking about those experiences, and then you design everything else around it. It's kind of like you still have the same kit of parts, but you just start in a different place, and then you put the emphasis on the people, whether it's the users or the people that are working in the library. They become hyper important because it's all about them and the interaction, and different libraries will have different feels because of the people, especially. And this is where the librarian's role gets elevated, is that what the librarian is interested in, or what the campus is interested in or focused on, those become the subject matter of the library, or at least the components that are emphasized, because there is certainly some editorialization when something is curated. You have to decide what to advertise and what to not advertise.
Yeah, Sam, it's a great question to think about, the moving from a noun to a verb. And what struck me, Sam, in our own research, so Sam and I have been doing research for several years, maybe more than several years now, on asking our undergraduates, in this case in my library, about their place attachment to the library, how they feel, asking them to take us on a tour of the library, and some other various methods that we've used. And it's interesting to me that I think our patrons are there already. You know, when I went back and looked at the transcripts of our walking interviews with our students, you know, they use verbs. They were talking about things like, I'm going to check my notes here, you know, a meeting of minds. I come to the library because it makes me feel like it's a meeting of minds with all the books there, studying together, yet apart. I get up and I look at art when I need a break. So they're describing experiences as much as, you know, interaction with objects there. So I think that's a part of this. And it also, in looking at those responses, it reminded me that there is a line in cognitive architecture. And here we have a bibliography that's posted on the web. The address is on our first slide. Sussman and Hollander put out a book on cognitive architecture. And they note there that narrative has always been key to the human experience. And in fact, that might be a key to, you know, making us human. And that we look to derive meaning from our physical surroundings. And so I also think about that, is that as someone's coming in, they are looking to experience the library in a particular way. So there again, we're back to this activity of the verb. Yeah, so I move on to our third question, and then we have some questions in chat.
Sure, go for it.
We have to admit that this metaphor brings in complexity and distraction, maybe even a bit of chaos. Can't avoid that. It upsets the orderliness and the compartmentalizing that perhaps we feel most comfortable with. And of course, our patrons still need to be able to accomplish specific tasks. And actually, one question I want to get to in the chat, Alice mentions this. They still come in wanting to and needing to accomplish very specific tasks, use a computer workstation, know where to ask for help, etc. How do we solve for this in this design?
So I think part of the answer is in the intentionality of this metaphor being a labyrinth and not a maze. The labyrinth is about creating this enjoyable experience as you move through it, whereas the maze is about creating confusion and a puzzle. And so the goal is not to create a chaotic environment where you're bombarded with information that's too much, but there is still this expression component. So I think that there's a balance in there that is really important to design. I brought up the aspect of wayfinding in the library, and I think that this is an important component in it. That when you enter the library, you have a sense of where to go. When you're looking for something, you have a sense of where to go. Places are created for people, and it's not necessarily just a cacophony of information, but a well curated groupings of information. And also, there was Alice had a question in here about part of the question had to do with accessibility and moving, this notion of moving through a labyrinth of course raises concerns about, well, if you're going to take someone an extra mile to get somewhere, is that really in the interest of everyone? And so the notion isn't necessarily it's not literally a labyrinth. It's about experience. that you would get in a labyrinth. So shortcuts. You don't have to go through the full path to be able to experience the full experience. So it isn't. I think that if we think of actually if we think of the design that was for that South Korean library that was based on that, I can share my screen here. This idea, though it's a labyrinth, though it has the complexity of a variety of different nodes and it's got pathways that can be you could walk through this 100 different times and never go the same way. It's still a reasonable layout for anyone trying to get to any part of the library.
Oops.
Sam, did you have something to add to that?
Oh, I was just thinking about in terms of, the usefulness, I guess, for me of the labyrinth and maze metaphors or symbols here is that, and speaking a little bit to Alice, your question about the labyrinthine approach, covering more ground, whether metaphorical or physical. When a person is researching or studying or doing the tasks around learning, if they're uncertain that they're on the right path, if they're not quite sure what is the next thing that they need to do or how to get there or where they're going, those kind of repeated dead ends, I think, they take a different kind of mental and physical energy to do without a lot of positive result. And so, engaging with this kind of labyrinthine concept that every move forward is progress, and that it's progress, and kind of helping, how do we foster that idea that this use of your time and energy may be a little bit more than you're expecting, but that every point you're making forward, all the progress you're making is valuable. It is useful. And then kind of more toward the practical side of things, when you're in a maze, you are, that hedge maze idea, or, you're in that puzzle, you're not quite sure where things are at. You can really only see a very limited amount of stuff. And you may not know where all of the good services are, whereas the labyrinthine idea really increases the visibility of everything. That most labyrinths, traditional labyrinths, they're just a path on the floor. So if you really wanted to just walk to the center, you could, and you could leave whenever you wanted. So the idea of just really increasing the visibility of things, and maybe that means like physically lowering the stacks to a lower height, so that your users will always be able to see thoroughly through the library or across the library, kind of around those ideas there.
Thanks, Sam. Brent. Yeah. I just wanted to add here, and I'll refer again to Alice's question. I think, these are very important issues. Accessibility. I think Brent and Sam brought up some ways in which this metaphor can be used that would not impact the accessibility, which is an extraordinarily important issue to make sure that any design would end up having the ability for all of our patrons to move around the space without causing added problems, and in fact maybe solve some of the accessibility issues that we currently have. And so I do think the idea that it is not one path that you have to take. There are shortcuts that you can go through. I think that's one. The idea of lowering bookcases, which also responds to a different accessibility issue, but also allows the visibility so that you might find a more direct route to where you're going are certainly not the only things. I'm sure that there are many more things that we would have to consider, but those are some results. And then I thought the first part of the question about has there been any research done about this, the preference for transactional approaches. I mean, we hear it all the time. Our campus is a commuter campus, students coming in, hey, I just got off work. I have a half hour before my class starts. I need to accomplish this. What is a design that emphasizes a journey rather than the destination necessarily going to be helpful or hurtful for these students? And I think, quite frankly, the jury is out on that, right? I think we have some information. I think some of the answers that we've already provided in dealing with accessibility also answers that question as far as more visibility and shortcuts to places. I think technology is a response to that also. Again, that we don't have, if you want to hang out in the biology/anthropology node that's showing how those disciplines work together, and you find something there that you want to check out, you don't have to then go somewhere else, but you could check it out right there, remotely. You could browse the fuller collection of materials that we have, or the digital collections right there. So actually it could provide an ease that we don't currently provide in our libraries when we compartmentalize all these different services. And the other thing I want to bring up here with this is the idea of curiosity. There is, a significant research on how curiosity is very much related to learning and knowledge creation. And so the idea that we might be enticing our patrons more, right, with the way this design is, to express their curiosity more and to act upon the curiosity as the time they have the question, oh, I can just pull this off. Or I can go to this node and ask the biology faculty member who's hanging out there and during this hour. I think that could actually add to the depth of the learning experience. And I'll just, with that point, I'll just call people's attention to our bibliography again, because the Current Opinions in Behavioral Science in 2020, they did a whole issue. The whole issue was devoted to the connection between curiosity and learning. So I think that applies here.
I think that there are a couple of things that are concerns that are raised with this approach. One being space. Does this take more space? If you pay for a library, are we talking about creating more space? And then the other is time. Time is so precious these days. Does what we're proposing take more time? And so I think those are interesting notions. And on one hand, yes, the library modeled on a labyrinth will take more space, but it'll take more space for those places where people are supposed to spend time. The other places in the library can be super efficient. Maybe I would postulate that there could be a more public and a more private component to it, and we use technology to access that. So maybe there's a net, that there's a delta that isn't that significant. The other piece of this is time, and the thought that yes, it may take more time. You might spend more time in the library, but the hope is that you're going to get more out of it. But also using digital tools and technology, the actual searching and checking out of materials could actually be more efficient. So you're actually spending more time learning and being curious, but the actual searching could be quicker.
We've got a couple more questions that have just come in the chat. So I'll read Elaine's question. She says, I like the curve and flow of the Labyrinth patterns. How do you incorporate study desks within this? We find ourselves under increasing pressure to provide ever more study spaces within the library. What this made me think of, actually, back to some of the research that Karen and I have been doing, that students come into the library and oftentimes they have like one specific chair or study carrel or a seat in the library that's their most preferred space in the library. And if they don't get that, they have kind of backup choices, or sometimes they leave the library. And but the reason that they love that one spot is because of these various visible elements that are in the environment around them, whether that's a window or art or accessibility to like the copy machines. And so, part of this is really thinking about how do we create those little mini environments that people can fall in love with and want to spend time in.
And I would just add to that, having I talked about adjacencies and that the adjacencies in the design are so important. And so, yes, having those places to study carrels or places to collaborate that are adjacent or surrounded by the information that you're learning from is actually central to this idea as well. So the studying piece is definitely part of it.
Yeah, and I would just finally add to this is that I think actually a key to this design might be in the fact that really the heavily used part of the library would be curated so that the whole collection is no longer right there. A good deal of the collection can be stored in very, maybe compact storage, but at least in very space-saving ways, of accessible, but we're not trying to accommodate the whole collection in this kind of very active, pathway-centric part of the library. And so I actually would hope, because we're getting the same pressures, that it would free up space for more study space. And I understand that Jeremy would like to ask his question. He's joining the roundtable. Welcome, Jeremy.
Hi, thank you. First of all, just to say thanks very much for this. I'm really enjoying it because we're in the process of rethinking our own building. And I think a lot of what you said resonates quite strongly with some of the things we've been thinking about. We've certainly talked quite a bit about thinking more about curating the building, as you say, these idea of journeys, what we do with the journeys, etc. So I wanted to say that first before I put my question, which is slightly deliberately provocative, to put it out there. But obviously listening to you, and particularly some of the comments around about collections being virtual, and also being aware that coming from an institution where we have a heavy number of students who don't come on campus, and we talk quite a lot about what kind of experience do they get, which just then gets me thinking about also with the advantage of technologies, augmented virtual realities. Are we sure what we're talking about here is the best way to do things? Actually, should we be using the space to do this? Because actually some of these things could potentially be done better in a virtual space. As I said, slightly provocative because I'm a strong believer in the physical world and what that brings to us. But listening to you talk, that kind of starts to go through my head a bit. Thank you.
Well, you want me to take the
Go
first? Okay, because I was actually writing some notes down when I saw your question come in via chat too. First of all, I will fully admit that I think you're right. I think I do think I would like to see this in the physical world, but I also completely agree with you that we need to think about how we do this in the virtual world too. I myself will say that if doing that, I would also include our faculty from our digital technology and culture program as people who bring expertise to the table that I don't have in how we would do that. But I think you're right. And then I would also point out that, yeah, that one of the younger members of the LSW architects, when we were doing the design charrette there with them, kind of sketched out and pushed us to think about how we also incorporate AR into the physical spaces too, and that might be a way to expand the journey and also, again, think about giving our patrons options based on what their interests are, so that someone could navigate through in the physical space in a much more traditional way, but they could also have the option of picking up an AR headset and navigating that same space with additional information and additional experiences there with that. So yeah, I think you're right that we can't stop at just our physical space. Who else?
And I think what it makes me think of, and I mean, the past 2 years, we've all been basically participating in a global experiment around distance learning and distance participation. Here we are in an example of it right now, where a lot of our research that Karen and I did was pre-pandemic, thinking about their students' experience with the library, and what we heard about their preferred study spaces and what they liked in study spaces. They talked about what they had at home and what worked and what didn't work at home. And I think, I want to revisit that now with 2 of these years. But that idea that even though there's this virtual environment that we are engaging in, that we're participating in, we're still necessarily in we're still human beings in bodies occupying physical space. And so how do we help our students, whether they're in the library or distant, feel like they're part of that study environment? And I think actually I was watching a pre-recorded or a recorded a month ago, RLUK bit about space, talking about that very problem of like, how do we create an online environment that people feel like they can engage with, that maybe has other people in it that you're like, oh, they're studying too, I feel more like I'm studying. And I think that really resonated with me with this conversation that we're having. How do we expand the labyrinth into people's homes? I think that's a really interesting question. And the idea of the AR or the technological layers, where it's like, if you're in the library, you see the layers. If you're at home, maybe you can see in the library, something along those lines.
Sam, I just have to butt in here. Sorry, Brent, just because that is it. You brought up such an important point, because we have heard over and over again in talking to our students that part of what really helps them concentrate, stick with their studies, spend the time that they need to in the building is the fact that they see others doing the same thing, and that tells them what they should do. The meeting of the minds thing, several people commented on how just seeing the books made them think about how, oh yeah, there's this conversation, this research going on, and now I'm part of it. And that was so critical to doing that. And so, yeah, how do we recreate that in a digital fashion? I think would be very useful to our patrons who can't get to the buildings physically, because that really helps them concentrate. Sorry, Brent, I probably butted in.
It's okay. I think that if there's one thing that we've learned through the pandemic is that virtual meetings or technology can be a real asset in certain instances. And so why not make the most of it? So use it for what it's good at. So I feel like the physical footprint of the library, the value of storing millions of books that nobody can get to. There's not much value in that in terms of experience, and so that could be an example of something that could be entirely virtual. Also, being able to expand the footprint of the library virtually, being able to get into people's homes, get into various departments, and have an interaction outside the walls of the library. I think there's some real value to those two aspects of using technology. But like Sam and Karen were saying, using the physical attributes for what their highest value is also important. The community of learners, the energy of seeing people working and studying, and then raising the level of the materials on display and presented in the library itself, and doing the curation component to it. I feel like if you really faithfully blend the two, you could really raise the bar for research libraries.
Thanks, Jeremy. Did that help explore your question?
Yes, thanks very much. That's great. As I said, I am absolutely a supporter of the physical and that curation piece. But as I said, I thought it was interesting to explore that digital aspect. Thank you.
Definitely. It actually ties maybe nicely with another question that came in from Lindiwe. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. Lindiwe writes, I am wondering if you have considered the use of labyrinth approaches with digital collections. And so, getting into that, continuing to dig in, I think, on this idea of the kind of the virtual mirroring or layering with the real, that this is putting it out into the future a little bit with that whole AR idea, where it's there, but there's work to be done to make it truly ready to go and easy to implement. But that idea that these spaces in the library are curatable spaces. We also have the possibility of layering in things that are only available digitally. And so if there are screens, or if there are manipulatable digital elements within these spaces, or that in these created environments, I think we can really explore how we present curated digital collections in a similar kind of way. We're at 10 minutes left. Let's see. We can look at, unless you guys want to talk more about that, we can look at Lorna's question. At Strathclyde University Library, we have developed a virtual study sessions where students join a Zoom with others to study independently, but together for 2 hours each session. The library has created this virtual space directly in response to students' feelings of isolation during the pandemic. It has spawned an organic online community where researchers from multiple disciplines meet, engage, and support each other. That's a great, what a great idea, right? And I'll take it a step farther and say that, so in my workplace, right, I work in an office, the administrative side of things, and we're all getting more used to coming back to work together, but we don't want to lose our ability to use the functionality of online meetings or online gatherings. But our spaces aren't created for everybody to be like we are right now, sitting in front of a computer, talking loudly into a camera, even if we're wearing headphones, we're basically just disturbing everybody in the cubicles around us. And so we kind of have to like flip it a little bit and say, how do we create many enclosable spaces? There's like little phone booth sized like office pods that you can buy that you sit in and you can engage in the online environment. And so making the online environment more accessible to people in comfortable situations, or to be able to step in and do those when you're at work or when you're at the library, I think is an interesting other side to it. That if the online environment is attractive to you, how do you get there from the library in a way that doesn't disturb others?
I think the hybrid approach is one of the biggest challenges. It's one thing to be completely virtual and just rely 100% on technology to communicate and get information, and the other is 100% in person, see people and communicate and access physical materials. But when you combine the two, the challenge is really like Sam was describing. When you're in a virtual environment and a physical environment, you are intruding on somebody else's space, and so now you need to have a cubicle. But then the cubicle subdivides the open space, and you lose the attribute of having this collaborative kind of open environment. So I think that's going to be one of the biggest hurdles to design into this. But I also think that it's kind of key, because I don't think either are going away.
Mm-hmm. All right, we got 5 minutes left and two questions. So Danielle, and if we don't get to your questions, we can try and answer them offline from the portal. So Danielle asks how AR can be used on both ways, from physical space giving access to virtual and virtual giving access to physical, but also considering the accessibility issues the technology itself faces. And how do you feel about the data being collected to improve the library services? So I think we've been exploring this question a bit already, in terms of like kind of that bringing the outside in and the inside out, and that AR is a tool that can be used in that way. One of my concerns in my professional life is with digital equity, and so when I hear about technological solutions like this, I'm always thinking about like, well, it's not just do you have the tools or do you have the connectivity, but also are you comfortable using that technology? Are you familiar enough with it that you can make the best use of it? And I think that's definitely a concern that we need to be careful of. Not necessarily jumping in 100% on an idea that completely depends on technology to succeed, without being sure that we have options for people at different levels of skill and access. And I'm not sure about how do you feel about the data being collected to improve library services? Is that what we've seen from data, or are you worried about privacy with data? And then Chris.
I think Chris's question is very important. If we have another hour, we could start talking about that. But that one I think is one of the central challenges to solve, because we want both. We want to be able to have collaboration, and we want people to be able to focus in these spaces. But I think in the answer is flexibility and variety. I think having one solution for the entire space is probably not the answer.
Yeah, it makes me think of the idea of permeating the campus a little bit, that if you think about every study space on campus as potentially library space rather than each individual department's own study space, right? Let's just take over the whole campus. Everybody in this room should be into that idea, right? That
That's
idea.
probably a really good idea to end on, Sam.